One of the most important decisions you'll make at the very beginning of Resident Evil Requiem is the perspective that you'll be playing as each character. The game defaults to picking first person in Grace's sections and third person in Leon's. In my opinion, playing Grace in first person dramatically improves the horror experience. It pulls you right into the space with her. Every hallway feels much tighter, every corner feels much more dangerous, and every sound feels uncomfortably close. This perspective works because Grace's section of the game is very clearly designed with classic Resident Evil in mind. The structure feels almost like a deliberate throwback to the classic Resident Evil games. You will find yourself in a central area with two wings branching off on either side, packed with threats and locked doors that tease future progression. Stop me if you've heard this before. You're navigating this environment piece by piece, slowly unlocking new areas, finding keys, not so much solving as many puzzles as you normally would be, and deciding which threats are worth dealing with and which ones are better avoided. Zombies and stalker enemies patrol both sides of these wings, so every trip back through a familiar hallway carries a lot of tension. Even spaces that you would think were safe can suddenly feel hostile again for reasons we'll get onto in a bit. Grace herself plays a huge role in the fear factor of her sections. Unlike some protagonists in the series who feel almost superhuman at this point, Grace is clearly not a hardened survivor. The game communicates this through very subtle design choices. Her running speed feels just slightly slower than you'd want it to be, which makes every time you're chased from things and you're running away feel that little bit more desperate. When you move through dark rooms or tight corridors, she constantly makes small sounds like quiet gasps or nervous breaths, which make you think, what has Grace seen that I haven't? Why is she so scared? And it just makes you doubt everything and you become more paranoid. And the opening cutscenes of the game reinforce this idea even further. Grace is portrayed as timid and uncertain. She doesn't stride into danger like a hero. She hesitates, and you can see her vulnerability. At first glance, this might seem quite minor characterization, but these sort of things actually make a huge difference once you're actually playing the game, because when the character you control feels afraid, you often do so too. And that combination of perspective, classic survival horror level design, and character-driven atmosphere creates something that feels very authentically Resident Evil. Not the explosive action version of the series, but when it's slower and it's tense and it's carefully paced horror that is what defined this franchise in the first place. Grace is also, in general, just a really strong protagonist, which does help anchor the entire opening half of the game. She's got a genuinely interesting backstory tied to the hotel and the events surrounding her mother, and the voice actor does an incredible job of selling both her fear and her determination as things spiral further out of control. Another detail that really elevates Grace's section of the game is the way that Resident Evil Requiem handles its zombies. These aren't the usual shambling corpses that feel completely disconnected from who they used to be. Instead, the game leans very heavily into the idea that many of these people have only recently turned, and that small decision makes the entire environment much more disturbing. As you move through this sort of care centre, you will occasionally hear zombies speaking, not full-on conversations, but fragments, broken routines, little echoes of whatever they were doing before everything went wrong. Some of them are still obsessively trying to perform their jobs. There are infected workers who are constantly trying to turn off lights throughout the building, muttering about it while they move around the halls. This may sound like a tiny environmental detail, but in practice this affects the gameplay because it poses a question: what would happen if you turned on a light? If you're careful, you can manipulate these enemies without even firing a bullet. Instead of wasting precious resources, you can just turn the lights on, and the zombie will move to go turn it off. But the game will also throw in another twist. Some of the zombies are completely blind. At first, that might sound like it makes them easier to deal with, but the reality is that they will react more aggressively to sound, which then poses a question. What would happen if you threw a bottle at another zombie? This sort of thinking makes the game have that little extra edge, which means you can use them to your advantage. Plus, this suits Grace as a character. She is an analyst for the FBI. She is a smart lady. She would figure this kind of stuff out. Just when you start to feel like you understand how the enemies work in Grace's section, Resident Evil Requiem throws in another problem. The blister heads. Anybody familiar with, let's say, Resident Evil 1 will immediately recognise what these are inspired by. They function very similarly to the Crimson Heads from the Spencer Mansion. Every now and then, an enemy you previously killed will not stay dead. Instead, at some very inconvenient point later in the game, that corpse decides it's had enough of lying on the ground, and it gets back up. But it won't just get back up as the same zombie. It will have a blister for a head, ironically, and will be stronger and faster and much harder to kill. But the regular enemies aren't the only thing creating the pressure. Grace's sections also introduce several stalker enemies that roam through different parts of the care centre. One of them is a chef who patrols certain hallways and kitchens, slowly moving through the area while you try to slip around him. He's not the fastest threat in the world, but his presence definitely shakes things up a little bit. And then there's my boy Chunk. Chunk is exactly what he sounds like he would be. He is a massive brute that doesn't particularly care for walking through hallways. He simply tears through them. Doors, barriers, he'll just run through stuff. And then there is the most unsettling of the bunch, a girl who hates bright lights but absolutely loves ambushing you from above. More than once you will be creeping through a room thinking you have successfully avoided everything in that area, only for her to drop from the ceiling with a perfectly timed jump scare. Each stalker changes the rules slightly, which stops the gameplay from ever setting into a rhythm that is a bit too predictable. Without getting into too much detail, there is a portion of this game that feels almost like a direct homage to Amnesia the Bunker. The structure, the pacing, everything about it. Instead of carefully clearing the rooms or navigating patrol routes, you come to the realization that you are completely screwed no matter what you do, and you'll just have to adapt on the fly. No amount of preparation can save you. Moments like that show just how confident Resident Evil Requiem is with its horror design. It's not content with repeating the same type of fear over and over. I genuinely loved Grace's sections of the game, and I think that it is some of the best survival horror that this series has ever produced, and I think it was a perfect celebration of sort of the roots of this series. But before we get into Leon's section, a couple things to note. Firstly, if you're enjoying the video, may I interest you in a cheeky subscribe, as we are getting close to 2,000 subscribers, and that would make me a very happy boy. Secondly, in terms of spoilers, I'm not going to say anything spoiler related, but since the bulk of Leon's sections are in the middle part of the game, stuff like the location of his section will be in the footage, so just keep that in mind going forward. Leon's section of Resident Evil Requiem is far more action focused than anything you experience with Grace. In fact, the difference between the two campaigns is so noticeable that at times it almost feels like you've stepped into a completely different game. We essentially have two games in one here. Early on, the connection between the two characters is actually handled in a really clever way. For a brief portion of the story, Leon and Grace move through many of the same locations. The game tracks what you did during Grace's playthrough of those areas, and Leon's experience reflects that. If you killed enemies while playing as Grace, their bodies are dead when Leon arrives. If you avoided them and slipped past, then they're still alive and roaming the halls when you get there as Leon. And I wish the entire game was like this, but from that point onwards, the horror element largely disappears. Leon's story leans heavily into action, turning the experience into something much faster and much more combat focused than the care centre. The slow, tense survival horror atmosphere that defined Grace's section completely gives way to a much louder and aggressive style of gameplay. With Leon's section leaning fully into action, the pace of the game obviously ramps up dramatically. Enemies are far more aggressive here, they lunge at you incredibly quickly, they appear in large numbers, and the game rarely gives you the breathing room that Grace's section offered. Because of that, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. Leon does have a hatchet that can help manage enemies up close with parries and such, but it does come with limited durability which you will need to repair yourself, which means you can't just rely on it forever when things get hectic. A lot of encounters end up feeling like controlled chaos, where you're constantly trying to manage space whilst enemies close in from multiple directions, and unlike Grace's sections, stealth usually isn't a reliable option here. In the earlier parts of the game, you could often sneak past threats or manipulate them with environments, conserving resources and avoiding unnecessary fights. Leon's gameplay doesn't really allow for that approach most of the time, although you definitely can do some takedowns every now and then. Instead, the game will often throw you into what are essentially combat gauntlets, groups of enemies that flood the area, and your only real objective is to survive long enough to push forwards. The structure of these sections actually reminded me a little bit of certain parts of Silent Hill F, where the game would lock you into really intense survival encounters, and the only way to progress would be to kill all of the enemies there. The big difference between this game and Silent Hill F, though, is that this game is actually fun to play, because despite how overwhelming things can get, Leon is absolutely stacked when it comes to weapons. As you progress through his section, your arsenal will grow larger and more powerful, and the gameplay really leans into the idea that Leon himself is an incredibly capable character. He's got his pistol, he's got the Requiem, he's got multiple shotguns, SMGs and rifles, grenades and all sorts of nonsense that can make light work of most enemies if you play your cards right. The classic Leon energy also shines through during all these fights, with his classic one-liners still hitting as they usually have done. But some of Leon's sections do drag a little bit, and the long detonator section is definitely the worst offender. There are definitely moments in it that I enjoyed, but a lot of the time I couldn't help but think about how strong Grace's section was by comparison. The slower survival horror approach just felt far more engaging to me, and I found myself wishing the game had continued leaning in that direction instead of pivoting so hard into action. I think if the game had interwoven it better with Grace's story, it could have worked, but it's a large section of the game dedicated to finding parts to blow up a gate. It is a largely nothing part of the story. The boss fights unfortunately didn't help too much either, I thought. There are quite a few of them throughout Leon's portion of the game, and many take place in some fairly tight arenas. On paper that sounds like it should create intense encounters, but in practice most of them follow a very familiar formula. You spend a lot of time running away, waiting for an opening, and then firing shots into whatever glowy or gooey weak point the boss happens to have. After a while that pattern starts to feel very repetitive. The spectacle is always there, but the fights themselves rarely evolve in many interesting ways, and without spoiling or showing it, the final boss of the game is pretty much a clone of the final boss of another Resident Evil game. Also, there is a supply box system. Instead of something like the Merchant from Resident Evil 4, Leon has access to this upgrade box where you can buy armor, unlock new weapons, and improve your existing ones. You earn points for it by killing enemies and collecting items that can be traded in. This may sound like a reasonable progression system, but I never really found it that satisfying to use, and it felt pretty bare bones and tacked on. But I feel like if you were to compare this to the Merchant from Resident Evil 4, then it definitely falls short, and I feel that this comparison is kind of unavoidable. Now, I'm not saying that the Merchant should have been in this game, because I don't think it would have fit tonally at all, but what I mean is that when you look at Leon's section as a whole, it often feels like a slightly weaker version of Resident Evil 4 Remake's gameplay. The action is still enjoyable, and there are plenty of fun moments along the way, but it's hard not to measure it against one of the most beloved games in the series, and improving on something that close to perfection was always going to be an incredibly difficult task. It may sound like I've said that Grace's section was amazing and Leon's section was awful, and that is not really the case. Grace's section is amazing, Leon's section is just good, but that still averages out to a pretty damn good experience overall. Before talking about the story itself, I should quickly mention how I'm going to be handling spoilers here. Throughout this section, I will be showing cutscenes and moments from across the game, but I'm deliberately avoiding anything from the ending section. If you're planning to play Resident Evil Requiem yourself, you'll still be able to experience the final stretch completely fresh, and without context, the footage I'm showing probably won't mean much to you anyway, but I just wanted to be transparent about that regardless. Now, the story itself actually begins with a really intriguing premise. Grace returns to the hotel where her mother died 8 years prior, and before long she finds herself caught up in the kind of chaos that only seems to happen in a Resident Evil game. And that description is pretty accurate for how the story unfolds. It is very much classic Resident Evil nonsense, in a good way. The early parts of the game feel relatively grounded and mysterious like they usually do, with a strong horror tone that keeps things tense and unsettling, but as the story progresses, it does escalate in the way that, again, most Resident Evil games do. The horror is of course strongest in those early hours, as we mentioned before, and as the narrative expands and the scale of the events grow larger, the focus very much shifts away from pure horror. That doesn't mean the game suddenly turns into Resident Evil 6 though. The escalation never quite reaches that level of explosive absurdity, but there are definitely moments, particularly in some set pieces, where you can feel small echoes of the action heavy style starting to creep in, but I don't think it's ever as bad as Resident Evil 6 is. As the story does progress, it becomes increasingly clear that Resident Evil Requiem isn't trying to necessarily just tell its own story, it's also celebrating the series that came before it. Throughout the game there are callbacks, there are references and moments that long-time fans will immediately recognise. Certain locations, certain enemies, and even a few specific boss encounters like love letters to different eras of Resident Evil. There were multiple points of the game where I genuinely just sat back for a second and thought, wow, that is just cool. Because of that, I honestly don't think that Resident Evil Requiem should be someone's first Resident Evil game. A lot of what makes these moments special comes from understanding the history behind them. The game assumes a certain familiarity with the series, and if you have that history with it, the experience becomes so much richer. There is a section of this game that I think if this were to be your first Resident Evil game, you would find incredibly boring, but everybody else will wish that section was longer. This game feels less like a simple sequel and more like a celebration of Resident Evil itself, but also of the two genres the series helped define, survival horror and action horror. Grace's sections do capture that slower, methodical tension that made the early games so iconic, while Leon's campaign embraces the explosive, weapon-heavy chaos that later entries became known for. And seeing those two styles exist side by side in the game is genuinely fascinating. Even if I think they could have been paced a little bit better, I liked it a lot more at the beginning when they were more intertwined. But for what it's worth, I beat the game on a first playthrough where I explored everything in 12.5 hours. For that reason, Resident Evil Requiem stands out as something special. It is confident in its identity, proud of its legacy, and packed with moments that remind you why this series has remained so beloved for so long. Because Resident Evil Requiem isn't just a great addition to the franchise, although it definitely is, it is a fantastic celebration of Resident Evil, and without a doubt, an early contender for Game of the Year. If you made it this far into the video, then thank you very much. It means a lot to me, and if you did make it this far, I assume you enjoyed it, in which case leaving a like or a comment telling me you enjoyed the video would really make my day. Also, just to keep you aware, I don't know the exact order I'm going to upload the videos in, but I am doing a ranking of modern Resident Evil games. It might be out by now, it might be out on Thursday. Either way, keep your eyes peeled for that and subscribe to see it. We've also recently enabled memberships on the channel, so if you wanted to support the channel and gain early access to new videos, then that option is always there, but feel no pressure at all, it's absolutely fine. Anyway, that is all. I will see you whenever you next watch one of my videos. Have a lovely day, and goodbye.